Today, of course, this is Thanksgiving week, and I hope that you have some kind of downtime plan where you're going to eat lots of turkey and experience the effects of tryptophan and zonk out and get some rest and relaxation. And at the same time, our world right now is embroiled in conflict. I was thinking when the kids were singing the song, "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands." That's an appropriate song right now, isn't it? All the stress in our world. We live in stressful times. And in addition to that, as Americans, we believe in hard work and little vacation, and we just don't get the downtime that a lot of us really need. And so this week would be a great time to put into practice some of the things that Dr. Peacock talks about today. We talk about the Sabbath and rest and rejuvenation. And Dr. Peacock and his wife Amy are actually leading a class right now, and you could still sign up this week if you wanted to. It's a 5-week class, and that would mean you'd have 4 weeks left. But my wife and I are hosting it in our home for the first couple of weeks. We started this past Monday. It was great, very freeing. A lot of people think of the Sabbath and they think of duty or legalism or a rule, and it was incredibly freeing, life-giving. The way I felt after you and Amy led the class last week was just a big breath of like, whew. How many of you feel like you could use some of that? And so that's what Dr. Peacock is going to bring here today. So I want to give him a formal introduction, and then we're going to welcome Dr. Cory Peacock. He holds a PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University. He specializes in the history, languages, and literature of the ancient Near East, focusing on Israel and Judah. In his work, Cory strives to make the Hebrew Bible accessible to non-specialists and has a heart for underserved populations. He's a founding member of the Sonoran Theological Group, which is a group in Phoenix, one of the first of its kind in the country to help make seminary quality education more available and affordable. So there may be some of you here who are interested in that. In his limited spare time, he enjoys board games, playing his ukulele, and spending as much time as possible with his 3 children. And today he's going to bless us with a teaching about the Sabbath. So let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Cory Peacock.
Hi, my name is Cory, and I'm a workaholic. Actually, that's the part where you're supposed to say, "Hi, Cory." So let's try it again. Hi, my name is Cory, and I'm a workaholic.
Hi, Cory.
Thanks. I don't want to work so hard, but there are just so many things that have to happen, and so many of those things rely upon me. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done, or at least it's not going to get done right? I don't work all the time because I'm materialistic. My wife and I value simplicity, and in fact, our 3 little children are beginning to understand that value themselves, that of simplicity. So it's not all this stuff that makes me work so hard, or rather need to work so hard. I work my full-time job, no more than 50 hours a week, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my wife gets up and goes to work early. Those are her early days. So I'm left to get the kids up and get them fed and get the lunches made and get them dressed and get their hair done and get them out the door with Papa so that they can make it to school on time. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, when I get to work at 7:30 a.m., I feel like I've already put in a full day's work. After work, we have dance class or the ministry that our family does together, which is Young Life Capernaum. It's a ministry for people with disabilities. And when I'm not doing that, we're working with the Sonoran Theological Group, teaching about 1 night per week. And when we're not doing that, my wife and I have a lot of side writing projects. The sermon is supposed to be about Sabbath, but all I can think about is all the things I have to do. I don't have time to stop. I'm exhausted, I'm anxious, and I have to keep going. I mean, you brought me here to talk about Sabbath, and I'm really good about talking about the Sabbath, but I'm really rotten at doing it. I think maybe, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to take a quick power nap. And while I do, you guys read something, I don't know, how about Exodus 20? And that way, while you're reading, you're getting something out of the Bible, and I'm getting to both nap, and I get to fulfill one of the commandments. It's the one about, remember the Sabbath because a nap will help you from being grumpy. The Hebrew is kind of tricky there, so a lot of people don't even agree on the proper translation. In any case, we all know that in the same way that when your wife says to you, "I don't really need anything for my birthday," that you really had better come up with something fabulous for her birthday. When the text says Sabbath, what it really means is take a nap, you grumpy guy, okay? You'll be much nicer if you do. Isn't that what the Ten Commandments are all about? Just making sure we're nice and vaguely spiritual? Well, no, they're not, and it's not. I mean, the Sabbath is not ancient Hebrew for nap. It is about rest, but that doesn't necessarily mean sleep. The Sabbath is not what we've told ourselves it is. Somewhere along the way, we took the Sabbath and turned the centerpiece of holy living into something that is simultaneously a luxury, a triviality, and something that is all about us. It is none of those things, but in order to understand it, we have to look at Exodus 20. So let's do that. Before we do, though, the Hebrew in that verse is not hard. It's pretty straightforward. And frankly, I'm not a workaholic. I'm just a guy who doesn't do Sabbath as well as I should. And ultimately, that affects more of my life than I would like. So Exodus 20, let's see, do we have that on the screen? We're going to jump into it. What's right before this is verse 2. And that's the vita, that's the resume of God. It says, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. And any resume you have, it's good to start with the big guns, right? I brought you out of Egypt. What else you got, right? You don't need to list anything else on your resume when you've brought a whole people group out of Egypt. Pretty cool, right? It also gives the motivation for why they want to listen to him. This is not a remote God. This is a God that did something recently. So verse 4 then is the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Pretty simple. Verse 5, you shall not worship you shall not make for yourself an idol. That's the second commandment. And you shall not worship or serve them. That's the second commandment. The third commandment is do not take the name of God in vain. First three commandments right there. And then we get to the fourth one, which is in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We'll come back to the commandments 5 through 10 a little bit later, because recognizing the Sabbath as the fourth commandment is important. But did you notice in verse 11 what it said? It's gone, but that's okay. Right? The rationale for remembering Sabbath is creation. That's a good rationale, right? In Deuteronomy, which is the other presentation of the Ten Commandments, the rationale for remembering the Sabbath is the Exodus. So Deuteronomy points to Exodus, and Exodus points to the creation, kind of like a chain event. It is good because it reminds us that taking the Sabbath and continuing to take the Sabbath keeps pointing us back, all the way back to creation. And so let's think about creation for a moment. In Genesis 1, we have the 6 days of creation to start off, right? We have light, and then heaven, and then land, earth, and vegetation, all on day 3. It's a pretty good day, by the way. It's blessed twice on that day. Check it out, Google it, whatever. You'll see. And then on day 4, what do we get? We get the sun and the moon. Day 5 is animals. Day 6 is humankind. So day 7, that actually starts in Genesis 2. So do we have that? Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So on day 7, 2 things happen. 1, he rested from work. And 2, he blessed the day. Each of these seems very important, and I'm not always even sure the why of it. We'll talk about it, though. So 1, God rested from work. Why did he stop where he did? It seems like there's so much more he could have done before stopping. I mean, he hadn't even created a lot of things yet, like apple pie, or the Apple recording label, or the Apple Watch, or apple pie. Did I say that one already? Do you wonder what I was eating while I was writing the sermon? A great 12th century Jewish commentator known as Moshe ben Maimonides, also known as the Rambam. They all have lots of names. I don't know why. He said that God had finished all of his creation from nothing on that day and left the job of information for later. So what does that mean? In much the same way, if you drive around the valley, or at least especially in central Phoenix, you might notice there are lots of gaps of land, right? They build the big building here, and you go 2 blocks before, there's another big building. There's this gap, right? That's kind of what Rambam is saying here, right? God put up the big buildings and left the gaps and did the infilling later. That's the idea that the Rambam is putting out here. According to the Rambam, it was broad strokes first, fine detail later. Okay. But there's another Jewish commentator from the 12th century in Spain, known as Rashi. Many of you might have heard of Rashi, famous Jewish commentator. In fact, his commentary is often in any Jewish Bible you buy. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's Rashi and what's the actual Bible if you're not looking carefully. But he said something that is simpler and I think the better explanation. He said of this verse, what did the world need? I think Rashi was saying, the world had all the stuff it needed. But after his question there, he added one word, and that word was rest. What did the world need? It needed rest. Rashi explains later that God ascribed rest even to himself to teach as an example so that humans would learn that if God, whose work is accomplished without any toil or fatigue, rested on the Sabbath, surely people whose work is only accomplished with hard work and fatigue must rest on the Sabbath. The other thing to notice about this day is what happened on day 7. The verb that's used here is kala. And in Hebrew, this is often translated as completed, but it more frequently means like ceased or stopped. That is, God ceased working on his creation, and then he rested. Now, if the Rambam, the first guy, Rambam is right, then there was more to do later, and so he took his Sabbath from the big stuff of creation, the broad strokes, so to speak, because there was more creating to do later, and this was the appropriate time to work. But even better, if Rashi was right, then he ceased working because rest was a part of creation. Do you follow me? He needed to rest in order to complete the creation. Rest, then, is a part of the act of creation. What does that mean for us? We are tempted, sorely tempted, to keep going until everything is just so. We must finish our work. We must clean our house. We must make it presentable. We must finish this project. We must send that email. And then we'll stop and rest. But it never stops. It's never done. There is always one more thing to do. What if we reframe our work in this way? Not that we rest when we are done. Rather, we are not done until we rest. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, said this: that divine rest on the 7th day of creation has made clear 3 things. A, that Yahweh is not a workaholic. B, that Yahweh is not anxious about the full functioning of creation. and see that the well-being of creation does not depend on endless work. If God knows that the world won't stop spinning unless he does endless work, why do we think it will stop if we do? So the second thing to notice about day 7 is that God blessed the day. Why? Don't really know. I just know that he did. And so let's return back to the Rambam for a moment. He tells us the what, not the why. He said, God made Shabbat, which is the Hebrew way of saying Sabbath, Shabbat, the fountain of blessing, the foundation of the world, and the partner of the assembly of Israel. God sanctified the Shabbat by enabling it to draw from the realm of holiness. Wow, that's pretty amazing. It is for the Rambam as if, in order to drink from the fountain of holiness, you must be in the right place, so to speak. You must be present in Sabbath. Stopping in that place allows you to drink deep from the fountain of holiness. What a wonderful metaphor. And while I like it, I always seem to like what the Rambam has to say second best. So I'll turn to yet another Jewish commentator, Abraham ibn Ezra, also from the 12th century of Spain. I like these old guys. Ibn Ezra said, God blessed the seventh day by causing the body to have renewed reproductive capability and by giving the soul renewed intellectual capacity on each seventh day. Today, psychology journals have articles that are titled, Rest is Not Idleness, and Let the Body Rest for the Sake of the Brain, and Rest is a Key Part of Life. The modern take on rest is that it rejuvenates us. Ibn Ezra said that long ago. God rested from all the work which God had created so that creation could reproduce itself. And that starts with us. So let's look at the fourth commandment now in its place. The first three commandments are centered on God, right? Have no other gods. Don't make idols. Don't take his name in vain. These are all about the proper way that people should address God and the way to keep God central. The 5th through the 10th commandments are all about how people interact with one another, right? Or more accurately, what types of behavior are truly helpful for us as individuals and a community. Honor your parents. Do not murder or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness or covet. That leaves the 4th commandment in this special place. It is the bridge between the two, offering us that sacred space to get right with God in order that, or so that, we can continue to do right by others. Without the Sabbath, without taking the time to draw closer to God, we're more tempted to to act out of our own strength when dealing with others. We may not kill, but we get so angry at people. And we call them names. Maybe not out loud, but in our heads. And Jesus said that wasn't exactly better. We may not commit adultery. Of course, not literally, right? We're all too nice and morally upright for that. But maybe we let our minds drift. And God said that wasn't exactly better either. Jesus said that. The Sabbath and the space it offers us to connect with God is that thing that allows us to see the other commandments not as a list of rules to follow, but as life-giving guidance for our lives. Life-giving guidance for our lives. Yet we treat the Sabbath simultaneously as a luxury and a triviality. It is a luxury that we cannot afford to take. Oh, it's okay for someone else, but I'm just too busy to stop. The Sabbath is for those with the luxury of time, right? But as such, it then becomes a triviality because I don't need to take it, right? The Sabbath is a nice suggestion, but if I don't take it, it's no big deal. Well, it is a big deal, and we'll return to that. But let's note the verbs used of the fourth commandment. In Exodus, the verb used is remember the Sabbath. And in Deuteronomy, it is keep the Sabbath. Do either of those sound like suggestions to you? Well, they don't say, have no other gods, do not murder, honor your mother and father, and if you could work in the nap, that would be nice. No. They're imperatives. They're commands. Just like the other 9 commands. For all that, to truly understand the Sabbath, let's back up to the first and second commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not worship them or serve them. We can abstract these gods and make them into modern contrivances like TV and money and work and pleasure. And we'll circle back to that. But in the ancient world, when they said gods, they meant gods. They did. For most of their early history, the ancient Israelites believed that the world was full of gods. But for those who left a record for us in the Bible of their engagement with God, with Yahweh, they realized that Yahweh was their God. We are His, He is ours. So the Israelites understood early on that God wanted more than sacrifice. You find this throughout the Old Testament. He wanted engagement with them. He wanted their hearts. If their hearts were not right with Him, then sacrifice did not matter. But if their hearts were right, then all of their actions become sacrifices to Him. This freed the Israelites from the constant requirement of having not just enough to survive, but enough to survive and then offer to the gods. They were freed from that constraint. Other gods gave no such space. They wanted your lamb, your bull, your bird, your firstborn. What does it matter if you love me but don't show me? For the other gods, as a general principle, it was more of a quid pro quo. You give me sacrifices, I look out for you. And so in the ancient world, where the gods are capricious, seemingly out to get you unless you keep them pacified, you're in constant danger of the gods overwhelming you. It was not that much different than the small business owner who's trying to stay safe with the mafia. The mafia comes around and says, you give us money, we'll protect you from big mean guys. Never mind that we're the big mean guys. And so you live in a constant state of anxiety, wondering whether you've done enough to satisfy your God, whether you've paid enough on your insurance bill. But we do that too these days. And yes, our gods are metaphorical and abstract. We have the gods of just a little bit more and keeping up with the Joneses and my retirement or my kids' college fund. Those are the financial gods. Then there are the self-worth gods of self-sufficiency. And I'm the only one who does it right. And the world stops spinning without me. And my favorite, they said I couldn't do it. Or the family gods of doing this for my kids. Or just one more gift for Christmas. Or those braces won't pay for themselves. We allow these things to crowd out our reliance on God and His commandment of the Sabbath. I should rest, but I've just got to satisfy these other gods for part of the day. Well, that took a little longer than expected. And again, we don't say it that way, but we live it out that way. When we allow our anxiety to drive us beyond our capacity, it begins a chain reaction, sort of like a butterfly effect. Do you know the butterfly effect, right? Where the butterfly flaps its wings in Tokyo, and that causes just a little bit of a difference in the wind pattern, and that causes another difference and another until you get a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. So in keeping the Sabbath, is keeping the Sabbath like the butterfly effect, where one seemingly innocuous compromise on Sabbath blows up into a hurricane where we're living outside of God's will? Well, kind of, but not entirely. Even as I draw this picture, take it with a grain of salt, though, okay? When we serve the gods that require production or worship at the altar of consumerism, we must work longer hours in order to get the means to satisfy these gods. We need a raise, so we look for a promotion or another job. But in order to compete, we first have to make sure to get a little more education or another certification. We work longer hours and answer our emails late. We crowd out all our space in order to produce and consume. And then we see our kids, and we think they're doomed to a miserable life unless they're 21st century ready. That means the best school, which means the best grades, which means the best SATs. But oh my gosh, everyone has that. So now we need extracurricular activities like dance and sports and volunteer work. And does your kid know Spanish and Mandarin? And have they built their iOS app yet? All this production and consumerism leads to, as Brueggemann has put it, violence. We need all the resources right now. And so we commit acts of violence towards the earth, overusing the resources rather than being stewards over them. And then we learn words like fracking. We do violence because we are so worried about all of our stuff and our place that somebody would or could take it from us. We must resort to violence, if only in our thoughts. And I've worked so hard to be here. We don't acknowledge our anxiety because we don't recognize it. While we may see how tenuous our grasp is on our position and on wealth and stuff, we become afraid because we know how easily it can go away. And we don't actually see the anxiety in some cases. The scholarship that I want could go to somebody else who did just that work that little bit harder than I did. The promotion could slip away because I wouldn't put in enough overtime. My safety is challenged by any wingnut with a gun. So logically, I need one too. Or, we're better safe than sorry. So I'm sorry that your country is war-torn. We can't allow refugees here. After all, our precious American and Christian lives are worth more than yours. As everyone surely knows, safety trumps compassion. That's why Jesus criticized the Samaritan for his compassion and voted for the priest and Levite who safely passed in a wide arc around them. That's sarcasm, by the way. I'm not actually saying that if you don't observe the Sabbath that you're going to turn into somebody who hates refugees. There isn't a direct line between those two things. Yet there is something so central to our well-being about the Sabbath that big changes come when we choose to remember and keep the Sabbath or when we choose not to. That's because the verb from which Sabbath comes from is Shabbat, and it means to stop. It is as simple as that. Stop your anxiety, stop your production, stop your work, stop yourself. When we take a whole day to stop, our unbridled pursuit of more is halted. It is the check on ourselves that halts the whole butterfly effect from constant production through anxiety to fear of losing all that we have. When we see how Sabbath can keep us from going down the path we don't want to go, that it, in part, keeps us from ignoring the man who is left for dead, we begin to realize that the Sabbath is anything but trivial. So how do we stop? Must it involve rest or sleep? Well, there's not much in the Bible, the biblical text that tells us. Exodus says, remember the Sabbath and points us back to creation, and Deuteronomy points us back to the Exodus. Remember that you are slaves in a production-centered system and that you are now free of those constraints. I, Yahweh, don't want that for you because I know where it leads. Deuteronomy 5, the second set of 10 commandments, is followed by Deuteronomy 6. And that's the passage that says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And it goes on to say, teach it to your children, these commands. to the next generation. For in the retelling, you are remembering God's goodness to you and the generation that came before. You are participating in keeping alive those acts of God among his community. In short, you are drawing closer to God. So when you draw close to God, you are participating in Sabbath, whether that is in rest or remembrance, sharing with others the things of God, or doing something that brings you rejuvenation. That is Sabbath. That brings us to the third thing I said at the beginning. We treat the Sabbath as a luxury, a triviality, and something that is all about us. In the end, Sabbath is not about us, even if it brings us rejuvenation. It is about drawing closer to God, and that takes many forms. So where do we end this discussion? Let's end with Jesus. In Mark 2, verses 23 through 28. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" I picture a whole bunch of guys going, look what he's doing. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Why does that count as an explanation? I mean, it does, but why? The Pharisees were concerned with the narrow conception of Sabbath. The rules that mean you get to do X and you cannot do Y. It is all about the work that should not be done, and it is not about the rest that completes the work. In a perverse kind of way, this actually reinforces the production understanding, the notion of production. Jesus and his disciples picking heads of grains means that the field owner has now lost his product. He now has to work harder to make it up. And now he's resentful towards the day because if I wouldn't have rested, I wouldn't be behind. But that's the implicit question in Jesus' action. Are you focused on the produce or the life given through the grain? Which perspective gives life? Which perspective takes it away? Jesus, in the way that only he can, kept the Sabbath by breaking it. But that's not so surprising, is it? Jesus lived by dying. The Sabbath rejuvenates by stopping. By breaking the cycle we so easily get caught in, we are encouraged to stop, to draw close to God, to rest and reset our perspective. It's no wonder that the Jews consider the Sabbath the highest of all holy days. Hi, my name is Cory, and I'm on a journey to understand the Sabbath better. And it begins by stopping.